We are looking at international capital movement, and in the previous video I explained the difference between foreign portfolio investment and foreign direct investment, and then we also looked at different types of MNCs or multinational corporations, and either there is horizontal integration or there's vertical integration. And then I also talked about the problem of transfer pricing, and then we looked at the reasons or the motivations as to why companies place foreign direct investment in other countries. Reasons could be their resource seeking, market seeking, or efficiency seeking. In this video we'll look at the consequences of FDI on the host country, the country which receives foreign direct investment, and we'll also look at one good and one bad example of foreign direct investment. Now let us examine the consequences of FDI on host country, and we'll look at the positive impacts of foreign direct investment. One of the consequences of FDI on the host country is to fill the savings investment gap. For the moment, just consider a developing country. It is trying to grow, and so it has huge amounts of investment needs. It wants to invest in education, in infrastructure, in machines, and so on. But since it's a growing economy, the savings there or the domestic savings in the host country are not enough to permit larger amount of investments. So what FDI does is, in a way, bridges this gap, because another country supplies you investment, and so you don't have to save for that per se. So this is the first reason, as first consequence of FDI on the host country, and that is to fill the savings investment gap. Number two is, whenever you open up a plant or an industry in another country, what you are transferring is technology as well as management style to the host country. So what we have seen is FDIs become a big time transmitter of knowledge to the host country, and that has a tremendous amount of beneficial impact on the host country. The third consequence of FDI is that when factories etc. are opened in the host country, you're going to employ local people, and so it increases local employment. Another benefit of FDI in the host country is because of the linkage effect, and there are backward and forward linkages, and that means more associated industries or factories open up because FDI has opened. And so in that sense, FDI becomes the engine of growth, and more industrialization takes place in the host country. And we have seen this example in several countries around the world. Now let us consider two examples of the impact of FDI on a developing country. And as a first step, we'll look at the good example, and then we'll look at the bad example. Now, one thing you should know is, whenever a country embarks upon the path of industrialization, the first industry they start usually happens to be textiles. It happened in the case of UK when Industrial Revolution took place. Remember the case of spinning jenny, and so textiles was the major export of UK in the 18th century. And then for the US, again the same thing, textiles became its important export initially. So textiles is an important industry, particularly for countries that are embarking on the path of industrialization. Now, in order to help developing countries grow, one of the ways to do so is the path of industrialization, and the first industry that most of these countries latch on to or start is the textile industry. And so the developed countries came up with what is called MFA, or the Multi-fibre arrangement, and this was signed in 1974 What it did is the following. It assigned quotas, or the maximum amount a country could export, a developing country could export to a particular developed country, insofar as it relates to clothing and textiles. For example, Japan, South Korea, and so on, they wanted to export textiles and clothing to the US. They faced the maximum amount they could do so. For example, 600,000 pairs of white socks and so on. So exact physical amounts, which limited the amount of exports coming from these countries. But one of the intentions of this was also to help these countries develop. And this was considered to be such a bad example of helping other countries, MFA, that this was ultimately given up, and it expired in 2004. So you should know this background. And now let us look at two countries. South Korea had an MFA arrangement with the US, and in 1970s South Korea had reached its limit of how much it could export to the US. Then there's another country called Bangladesh, which had received no MFA, or was quota free, because it was hardly exporting any textile or clothing to any country. So let us look at this. Now, a company called Daewoo was one of the industrial giants in South Korea in 1970s, and one of its exports used to be textiles and clothing, and it had reached a limit as to it could not export more than what it was exporting of textiles to the US. And then we had this country Bangladesh, which was quota free, and in 1970s government exports of Bangladesh were negligible, hardly anything. And so what Daewoo did is it signed a contract between itself and a company called Desh of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country in South Asia, and this is what Daewoo did. It set up months of training for Desh workers, the company in Bangladesh, about just 130 workers, and they were trained in the textile operations in South Korea. Then Daewoo, what it did is it helped start up activities to involve purchase of machinery, and all this machinery was purchased from Daewoo by Desh. And then Daewoo also installed and supervised and advised actual startup production. Daewoo provided all intermediate inputs like fabric, etc. Daewoo also handled marketing, and for all this Daewoo received a 3% sales as royalty and 5% sales as commission for marketing. Now, what Daewoo did is, in a way, transferred its technology, gave money, and also its management style to this company called Desh. And Desh learned different aspects of business from Daewoo, and by 1985 there were 700 garment exporting manufacturing units in Bangladesh. And how did they start? They were all former employees of these companies, Desh. And where did these workers get trained? They were trained by Daewoo. And then what happened? In 1970s, garment exports of Bangladesh used to be very, very insignificant or negligible. And by 1980s, they had become about $500 million exports of garments from Bangladesh to rest of the world. And by 2000s, this had become a multi-billion-dollar industry in Bangladesh, and most of the exports coming out of Bangladesh are basically textiles, and Bangladesh has become the second largest exporter of textiles now, and it is expected to overtake China in the next 5 to 7 years. So what foreign direct investment from Daewoo did is it invested in a country which had hardly any exports of garments, and within 20-30 years it has become one of the leading exporters of textiles, etc. in the world. And this, I think, is a phenomenal result, and this has led to employment of a large number of people. There has been an increase in income, and of course Bangladesh is earning much deserved or much needed foreign currency. Foreign direct investment is done by MNCs or multinational corporations, and some of these multinational corporations are very large in relation to the economies in which they are investing. To give you an example, there is one company called General Motors in the US, and in 1970s the gross sales of General Motors were equal to half the GDP of India. So just imagine 450 to 500 million people were generating an income which was just double the total sales figure of General Motors. So these companies can be very large in relation to the economy of the host country, and then they can also come with a lot of negative factors. They can influence a lot of decisions in their favor, and they may indulge in corruption and so on. Look at an example. There's a US-based company called Union Carbide, and it produces chemicals and things like that, and it had a plant in Bhopal in the central part of India. So, and these plants owned by Union Carbide were regularly inspected by Indian inspectors, and on the night of December 2nd, 1984, a mysterious gas leaked from this plant owned by Union Carbide, an American-based company, and this was an odorless, colorless gas, but it was very harmful. It's called methyl isocyanate, if I've got this name correctly, and it leaked, and what it did is it harmed a lot of people. I believe 2,500 people were killed because of this leakage of gas by Union Carbide plant, and I believe 500,000 people were either injured, or they lost their vision, or they faced some kind of physical impairment. So this was had a very bad consequence on people living closer to the plant owned by Union Carbide. So this company was owned and operated in the US, and it had plants in countries like India. Since it was based in US, Indian government had to fight a case in the US courts, and ultimately a compensation of $470 million was given to the Indian government to take care of these affected people, $470 million. And consider the following. In late 1980s, I believe, there was an oil spill by Exxon in Pacific Northwest, and a lot of salmon or fish died. And how much was the compensation given for environmental costs? It was close to $2 billion. So if 500,000 human beings are affected in a poor country, they are given $470 million as compensation. And if there's an environmental problem, more money is given to protect environmental issues. So at times you could have negative consequences, and it's not easy for developing countries to deal with such large multinational corporations. Now this completes our discussion of international factor movements. Thank you for your time.